Hi, my name is Zach Brooks, and I'm with the Arizona Worm Farm. You know why frogs live stress-free lives? Because they eat what bugs them. Garbage bugs me, and composting is a way of turning garbage into food. And we're going to talk just a little bit about how we do composting at the Arizona Worm Farm. We're going to start with static composting, the kind you can do in your backyard without worms. And then we're going to talk a little bit about composting with worms. So why compost? 3 really great reasons to compost. First and foremost is it's a way to effectively use resources that would otherwise go into the landfill and create methane gas. So we can take those resources, the second reason, and we can feed them to our plants in an organic manner that'll help the plants grow bigger, faster, quicker, healthier without spending any money on it. And my favorite reason is it helps us turn garbage into food. Compost is simply organic material that's been broken down into nutrients that plants can use. So the basics of compost are really very, very simple. The Arizona Worm Farm, we use 3 inputs. We use ground landscape waste that's diverted from our local landfills. We use fruit and vegetable waste. And we use composted horse manure. We use composted horse manure because it gives us a nice nitrogen base to our compost. But if you don't have a horse, not a problem. It works really, really well with just your fruits and vegetables and your brown waste. So let's jump right into it and let's talk about what it takes to have an outdoor compost pile. Now, I'm going to use a miniature version of a large compost stack that we use at the Arizona Worm Farm. The ones that we use, we take a 1/4-inch hardware cloth and we cut it into about a 10-foot piece, and when we roll it up, it's about 3 feet around. The city of Peoria does an awesome job, and they'll give you a free compost bin. You just need to call them and you can get that. So there's no cost to do that, but any large container works great. I'm gonna set this on top of my worm bin just so I don't make a mess here on the floor. But the best way to do this is just out someplace in your backyard, someplace under shade preferably, because we're going to want to keep it moist. And in the Arizona sun, it's hard to keep compost moist. In my backyard, I use this ring, and I actually put a layer of weed cloth around this, which helps keep it moist. It's a nice additive. So how do we make compost? Compost is very, very simply a combination of stuff that's green. And in this case, I had an awesome watermelon for lunch. This is what was left from that watermelon. And so I'm going to use that for my green layer. I also had a pineapple, and so that's some pineapple waste. A little bit more of that watermelon, some cantaloupe, and that's my green layer. What's green? Green is anything that grew in the ground that you ate. Anything that's left over from that is a green layer. What does that mean? Apple cores, banana peels, coffee grounds, anything that grew on a tree. Coffee grounds obviously are the beans that grew on a tree and were ground up. Pasta works fine because it started as grain, old bread, cereal, stuff like that. Anything that was green. Grass clippings can work as green. Anything that grew naturally becomes a green layer. We cover that green layer with something brown. What do we call browns? So browns are anything that used to be a tree. Ground up mulch. In this case, I'm going to use shredded cardboard. The easiest way for me to get shredded cardboard, my wife manages to get 3 or 4 Amazon boxes in our house every single day. I cut them up into strips, 2, 3, 4 inches wide, put them in a 5-gallon bucket of water overnight, and the next morning they just tear up super easy. So I'm going to cover my greens with browns. And by soaking this overnight, I solve one of the big Arizona problems, which is how do I get my compost damp enough for it to decompose effectively? So we recommend, if you're using mulch, if you're using leaves, if you're using any kind of ground up wood shavings, shredded paper, shredded cardboard, way easier if you just soak that overnight the night before. And then we add that on top. If we do a good job of always putting greens on first and then layering with browns, we'll keep excess bugs, smells, and all sorts of rats and stuff away. So really, really good idea to layer, just like a lasagna, greens, then browns, then greens, then browns. So I keep a bucket of browns available because every day when I'm done with my salad or apple core, banana peel, whatever's left, it goes into my compost pile, and then I have a bucket of browns that I put on top of it. Now I'm going to continue this layering, greens and browns and greens and browns, until I get a critical mass. And the critical mass is important for hot composting, because what's going to start happening is that as that green stuff starts to decompose, the microbes are going to start eating that. And if I have a critical mass of microbes, my pile will actually heat up. That's why at the farm, we do this 3 feet high. We start layering this stuff in, but we wait until it's at least a foot tall before we really heavily wet it. And the way this should work, and the way it will work in your backyard if you do this, once you get a pile 3 feet wide, at least a foot high, and you wet it up, it'll heat up. That heat will kill all the bad stuff. It'll kill any seeds that are in there. It'll kill any extraneous insects, and it'll start the decomposition process. Generally, it takes between 3 and 6 weeks for the pile to heat up and then cool down. You should feel it heat up almost the next day. It should stay hot for a day or two, and then it should start to cool down. We let it cool, again, somewhere between 4, 6, 8 weeks. Once it's cooled completely, we lift the container off of it. If you have a container that has a bottom or is a big one or turns, then you can just turn it. But we lift this off, we sit it next to it, we take a pitchfork, and we turn the material from the initial pile back into the frame. We wet it again, because will be clumps of stuff that hadn't gotten completely decomposed. They will start the decomposition process again, and so you'll see again your pile will heat up. You wait 4 to 6 weeks, and then it'll cool down. Once it's completely cooled, it's safe to use in your garden. And the really great thing about compost is there's no such thing as too much. You can't burn your plants, you can't burn your lawn by using this compost. So all your garbage can go in there. What don't we put in there? Typically, we don't put in 3 things. We don't put in anything plastic or metal because it just won't decompose. We try to reduce the amount of plastic that we buy because you're stuck with it. We don't put in meats and cheeses. The reason that we don't put in meats and cheeses is because, not that they won't decompose, they absolutely will, but they decompose slowly and they tend to smell. So if you put meat in, you're more likely to attract a rat, and nobody wants rats in their backyard. So we typically don't put in meats and cheeses, and we typically don't put in a lot of oils because, again, for the same reason, they just don't decompose particularly quickly. But almost anything else can go into a compost pile. The bigger your compost pile, the more forgiving everything is. You'll hear people say, don't put in onions, or don't put in grass seed, grass with heads. If you have a big pile, no problem at all. Okay, so once we turn that a couple of times, it's going to go from where it looked like cardboard and garbage to where it looks like a really nice, just a usable dirt. It'll turn brown, be a nice, fluffy, moist color, and then it's usable in your garden. And so you can take it out and spread it on your vegetable gardens, your trees, your plants, everything, whatever it is that you want to grow. Okay, so the awesome part about this is that you can do it almost anywhere, and you can do it in a pile as small as a 17 to 20 gallon bucket, and you can do it in as large a space as you have. So if you have a big giant yard with lots of yard clippings, they can all go into that static pile. It again generally takes between 2 and 3 or 4 months for the compost to be finished, which is why we recommend, if you have the space, do multiple bins. Do one active working bin, do one bin that's in the cooling phase, and one bin that you use. Keep in mind that if you do this all year round, you'll have always have one of each of those, so you'll have compost available when it's ready, when you're when it's time to plant. Okay. Now, another option, and one that I want to show you, is it's entirely possible to do what we call cold composting, where we don't have a critical mass of material. You live in an apartment, you live in a small house, you can compost just as effectively using worms. Worms will do that composting process for you, and I want to show you how you do that. This is a typical worm bin that we set up at the Arizona Worm Farm. We line the bottom typically with shredded cardboard, and that shredded cardboard is there to provide a nice drainage capability so that when we water these, we keep them damp and keep them moist. But worms are not fish, they can't swim, so we need to make sure that they get separated from the water. So we usually start with a layer of cardboard. We then add greens and browns, just like we do in these static piles. And we add worms.
I got worms.
I beg your pardon?
Now, there's a lot of different worms that you can use for composting. At the worm farm, we use red wigglers. And in a bin this size, we use about 1,000 red wigglers. Those are awesome worms for Arizona because they deal with they live nicely in a wider range of temperatures. So the red wiggler composting worms can live from about 25 to 30 degrees to about 90 degrees. We never worry about the temperature in Arizona winters. It never gets cold enough to where the core temperature of the bin drops below where the worms are comfortable. We worry about it a little bit in the summertime, and we'll talk in a second about how we deal with the Arizona summers. But for the most part, red wigglers are just the perfect composting animal for Arizona. What you can see here is that I'm just spreading these out across the bin. Worms don't have brains, so they're not smart enough to do anything except what they instinctively know how to do, but they instinctively know that light is bad. And so these big fat worms will, as quickly as they possibly can, get out of the light, get out of the sun. In fact, by the time we're done talking, we won't be able to see any of them visible on the top. They will all just naturally move underneath. Worms will produce a very effective microbe-rich compost all by themselves. We're going to feed these worms exactly the same way we fed our static pile. In other words, we're going to layer green layer covered with a brown layer. And we're going to continue to do that layer after layer after layer until the bin starts to fill up. What we are going to do with our static pile is we're going to feed them in sections. So we're going to feed a green layer covered by a brown layer on 1/3 of the bin. We're going to do the first third the first week, the next third the next week, the next third the week after that, and then we're going to start over. We're also going to water these. Worms need a lot of water, and so about once or twice a week, we're going to add 1 or 2 cups of water to the bin to keep it nice and moist. Same thing we do with our static pile. We add water whenever we feel like it's not damp and moist. Easy to do in our winter, harder to do in our summer. Easier to do in the shade, harder to do in the sun. So in an ideal world, we keep it in the shade. These bins do nicely indoors. If you do it properly, it won't smell. If your bin does start to smell, your bin is telling you that there's something wrong with it. And so it's either too acidic or you've put too much food in it, and it's really simple to clean up. Okay, so week 1, week 2, week 3, we're going to add a brown layer and a green layer. We're going to remind you that green is anything you like to eat, they like to eat. And the sweeter the fruit, the fatter the fruit, the more they like it. What's their favorite stuff? Pumpkins are awesome, avocados, banana peels, apple cores, anything with sugar or anything with fat, worms are going to love. We're going to cover that with anything that's brown. Again, anything that was a tree. Shredded paper, shredded cardboard, mulch, landscape waste, anything like that. It's going to take about 6 to 8 weeks before we get our first layer of worm castings, which are the compost that can be used for your garden and for the yard. We like you to wait between 6 and 8, sometimes 10 weeks, because the worms are going to take 2 inches of material, because you're going to add an inch of green and an inch of brown. They're going to take that 2 inches of material and they're going to compress it all the way down to about 1/4 of an inch. And that material is going to be microbe rich. Those microbes are the organisms that are going to convert what's in your compost and your organic material into what your plants need as food. And they're going to do it, they have a method of communicating between the plants and the microbes. So they're going to do it, they're going to provide your plants with the nutrients that they need at exactly the point in time that they need them. You're going to get slower, healthier organic growth, which is also going to prevent pests, because that plant is going to protect itself from pests from the inside out. The worms and their poop is going to tell the plants that there's bugs there even when there aren't. And that plant is going to protect itself from the inside out. So it's going to grow, you're going to get better, stronger, faster growth organically, and it's going to be a healthier growth that's going to protect it from the plants. Okay, so we did everything perfectly. For 6 weeks, we put in a layer, an inch of green, covered it with an inch of brown. We did an inch of green, covered with an inch of brown. We did that for 6 weeks. The worms were slow eaters, so we let it go even 2 more weeks after that. Now what? So at that point, we're going to harvest our castings from these bins. The easiest way to do that is to skip feeding the worms for a week. And I know that it'd be hard for us to skip a week, but worms can skip a week, no problem at all. The worms eat their food first and their bedding second, and they can live quite nicely for 3-4 weeks without any food at all. So it's really not it's not a problem. But so we're going to skip a week. So we're going to take an entire week where we're not going to provide them with any food. And then we're going to come in with a sweet piece of fruit. We're going to take half a cantaloupe or an avocado or a piece of watermelon, and we're going to put it on just one side of the bin. We're going to wait a day or two. When we come back, all of the worms in the bin will have moved to that other side, and there will be very few worms left on the side that we're going to harvest. We're going to reach in, and I'm actually going to show you, wrong bucket. I'm going to show you some of what we're going to get. And this is just as close to pure worm castings as we can get. So all this was 10, 12 weeks ago is food waste and ground up cardboard. It looks like soil, it looks like dark, rich fertilizer, but that was my lettuce, my leftover carrots and my celery and my apple cores. And the worms have turned it into worm castings, which are the perfect perfect food for most of your gardens. Okay, so after I've waited a week, after I've put that piece of fruit on the one side, the worms will all move over there. It's just a matter of me scooping out the bottom from my bin, and I usually put it in a bucket, and then it goes into the garden. Worms need to be kept reasonably cool. That's one of the challenges in Arizona, keeping them wet enough and keeping them cool enough. The ideal temperature for these worms is somewhere between 60 and 85 degrees. So from now until April or May, awesome. We don't worry about them at all. They can go outdoors on a patio, any place that's covered. They can go indoors and do great in a laundry room or even under your kitchen. In the summertime, we do need to worry about keeping them cool. Inside is the easiest in an air-conditioned environment, but outside works great. And the easiest way to cool them in the summertime, take a sheet of burlap or an old t-shirt, lay it over the top, and have it extend out. Put it into a jar of water. That water will wick the moisture into the burlap, and the burlap will help cool it nicely. All we're looking for is 10 or 15 degrees, because our daytime highs, even when it's 110 in the shade in your bin, will be 100, and if we can take it 10 degrees cooler than that, then the worms are going to be they're going to be great. Okay, typically we will see 2 or 3 key problems, and we want to talk about those problems both in if you're doing an outdoor bin where you're doing it in something like this, or in a big pile somewhere in your backyard, or in an indoor bin. The most typical problem that most people have in their backyard composting area is that it doesn't seem to compost. They'll go out in their backyard after a week or 2 or 3, and it still looks like food waste and newspaper or shredded cardboard. It hasn't really started to decompose. The way to troubleshoot that, or the solution to that, is to increase the amount of nitrogen, that's the greens, and then just wet it heavily, because typically most people don't keep their compost piles wet enough in the early sections. So during those 2 heating sections, remember when we put it in there for the first day or 2, it's going to heat up to 140, 150. It'll be so hot that when you touch it, it could actually burn your hands. If it doesn't do that, then we add nitrogen in the form of any sort of green, any sort of yard clippings or salad. Coffee from Starbucks works great. If you're having trouble getting enough greens, Starbucks is a really good place. You go in there and you ask them for the coffee grounds, and they'll give them to you. Coffee grounds heat up super, super well. So add greens and then wet it heavily. That's the most typical problem. If you find that you're adding stuff and it's not heating up, and no matter what you do, you just can't get it to heat up, then our recommendation is that you take it off and stack it and really get aggressive about adding greens. So typically we tell you to match greens and browns. There's slight percentages as why you might want to do it different, but we do seat of the pants composting in my backyard. Match greens and browns and everything will do well. If it's not, the one exception to that is if it's not heating up, add some extra greens. So take your pile out, turn it an inch or 2 at a time, and in between each inch, add as much greens as you can, and then add the rest of the material from this pile. Wet it heavily, keep it damp for a couple of days, and you should have it heat up nicely. The other problem that we typically see both in static piles and in bins is bad smells. Bad smells means you misbehaved, because if you do what we're telling you to do in the way that we're telling you to do it, you won't have bad smells. What bad smells mean is your bin has gotten acidic, or your pile has gotten acidic, or it is not doing the decomposition process properly. The solution to that is to just add browns. So we add greens if it doesn't get hot. We add browns if it smells, or if we have random insects that we don't want. By covering the greens with browns, we'll trap all of the smells on the inside of the brown bin. We'll keep excess animals and random things that we don't want out of our compost pile. Okay. If you do come down and decide that you want to get worms, then every once in a while we'll have somebody come in and their worms won't be hugely successful. And almost always that's a sign of not having enough water. So Arizona's dry. Inside, your air conditioning will dry it out. And if you're not running your air conditioning, you're running your heat. Both of those things tend to dry out the bins. And so almost certainly your bin isn't moist enough. How wet should your compost pile or worm bin be? The answer is somewhere between 60 and 75%, and they make moisture meters that you can buy. They're terrible. Save your money. What you need to do is to reach in and grab the bin, grab the material from your bin. It should feel moist to your hand. If you squeeze it, no water should come out. And that's the perfect amount of moisture. So it should be wet enough so that it feels moist, so that it holds together. But if you squeeze it really hard, no water should come out. If you reach into your bin and it feels dry to you, add water. If you're going to make a mistake, this is the one situation where too much water is better than too little water. Too little water stops the microbes from breeding and growing, and it's fatal for the worms. Worms drink and breathe through their skin, and so they need a moist setting and a moist environment to deal with. Okay, so that's all it takes. What can you use compost on? Absolutely anything that lives. Indoor plants, outdoor plants, grass, trees, fruits, vegetables. Compost works great for them. Compost, which you make yourself, is the best compost for your yard, because if you think about it, it takes the things that grew and it reprocesses all those nutrients back into food that you give back to those plants to produce the growth that they produced. It's absolutely free, doesn't cost anything once you've bought your bin. and you can't over-fertilize. Chemical fertilizers are not hugely effective over long periods of time. Chemical fertilizer will pass by the roots of your plant on its way to poison our water tables. And only about 15 or 20% of that fertilizer actually gets used by the plant. The rest of it is wasted. Compost, on the other hand, in concert with microbes, converts the nutrients in the compost into what the plants need at exactly the point in time that they need them. Okay, we are available if you have questions at the Arizona Worm Farm. Happy to help with any composting questions, either static composting or worm composting. And our advice is to just try it. It's way easier than it sounds, way easier than it looks, and you'll be really happy with the result. Thank you very much.